You were born in 1971 at General Hospital, then you went to Kampung Padang, Bangsar, Telawi, then TDI. But in the
Wow.
meanwhile, you also moved abroad. You were in Manila when your dad did his PhD. Then you were in New
Wow.
York when your mom did her
Yes.
PhD. So I
Yes.
imagine being so young and moving overseas must have left some kind of impact or influence on you.
Okay. Well, the first time when we were in Manila, I was not even 2 years old. So I don't have any memory of being in Manila then. I do remember my childhood year in New York. That would have been in 79, 80. What I think it left me was being comfortable with change in new situations because suddenly you're uprooted, you've put into a new school system, new friends that you have to form. And then just when everything settled down, barely over a year, relocating back in Malaysia, but then again, a completely new school system and all of that. So you just have to adapt. And I think that's been useful for me.
Even with that, being able to adapt to change, your parents also gave you something of an unorthodox upbringing. When you were 4 years old, they would ask you to speak up and speak out with all these professors and visiting academics. So what was that like?
Okay, wow. Well, yeah, I guess that is my childhood. I was brought into the adult conversations at home, and I would have to talk to my parents' friends who are, of course, professors themselves, right? And they would ask me about my thoughts on different subjects in school, or I had to show them the art. I remember being more worried about the art that I was going to show. But again, that for me gave me the comfort of speaking to adults and speaking up your mind because these adults were asking me what I thought about things. So I think you learn to form your own opinions early on. And I think, again, that's been very helpful and a big part of my formative growing up.
And is that why you were so drawn to the American liberal arts education system?
Well, I wouldn't put it that way. I think generally when I finished SPM here in Malaysia back in the late 80s, you were told four choices, right? Medicine, law, accounting, and engineering. And most people did the first three, which meant most of them would go to the UK or some in Australia. And because I can't stand the sight of blood, so medicine's not for me. And I remember thinking the legal and accounting textbooks are very boring because they don't have pictures and colors. So I wanted to choose engineering. And I think that in a way helped me skew my search towards the US. Because the other part for me, less about the country, but more to be in a place where there were as few Malaysians as possible.
And did the fact that you were terrified of snow have any part to play in choosing Stanford to study?
Well, just probably a little part. I wouldn't say I'm terrified of it. I definitely do enjoy holidays in snow. But what I know I'm really not a big fan of is cold weather where you have to day in and day out get up and go to school or get things done in freezing cold temperatures. So not a fan of having to live in very cold climates.
So what was it like studying in Stanford in the early 1990s? Because this was before the era of Yahoo, Google.com boom. So very, very different from what we know now.
Yeah, it was different, although it already had a very strong technology focus. And of course, at that time, the poster child for Stanford engineering was Hewlett Packard because they were graduates, right? And of course, Intel and some of these other companies, Cisco. But I think where Stanford probably left its biggest mark with me was being exposed to just the breadth of knowledge that's available out there, right? Because you come from an upbringing where these are the subjects and that's what you learn. And suddenly the menu that you can choose from was massive. Topics that I had never even dreamt of or had not heard of before. And also in the US education system, you have full flexibility. And so even though officially my degree says electrical engineering, I'm pretty sure I did the barest of minimum engineering classes to get that piece of paper. Everything else was, I remember, history, culture, psychology, economics, ballroom dancing, sailing, so many things to just get that breadth of ideas and being able to meet people from these very different academic disciplines.
When you were in Malaysia, you used to do competitive field hockey, but when you went to Stanford, you end up participating ultimate frisbee. How did that happen?
Yes. Well, I remember going my first year at Stanford and saying, hey, look, I do want to keep being physically active. And so I asked people in my dorm, hey, so where do I play field hockey? And they gave me this puzzle look like, field hockey? Don't you mean ice hockey? Because only girls play field hockey in the US. Men play ice hockey. I'm like, oh, okay, that's not going to be good because I can't ice skate to save my life. And ice hockey is a completely different and much more brutal sport. But I was still determined to kind of still be active. And that's sort of where I talked to a lot of people. And I found some people in my dorm who were just having a casual game of ultimate frisbee. And that really fascinated me, like a completely new sport. And what started off as just, casually learning how to throw a frisbee, I became quite obsessed about it. I remember spending late nights well in past midnight, just learning how to throw this frisbee down the narrow corridors of my dorm to make sure it doesn't fly away or hit people's doors. And eventually then I guess I was pretty decent enough that someone said, hey, you should try out for the Stanford team. And I did. And that actually became probably the one activity in my 4 years there that I spent the most amount of time, like 30 hours a week with the ultimate frisbee team. More, like triple the number of hours I spent in lecture halls.
And the final year was pretty significant for you as well, right? Could you share a bit about that?
Well, because in my final year, we became the number one team in US collegiate ultimate frisbee. Not only that, but very rare, we were the undefeated number one ranked team. Because in a typical season, we would have 50 games, right? 50 matches. And so to not lose a single one of that, it's very rare. It's like probably once in a decade you have a university that wins. It's a bit like, in English Premier League football, where so many teams win every year, but how many teams win undefeated? I can only think of like Arsenal, I think 2003, 2004, right? So in the last more than 15 years, no one else has repeated that. Being the number one ranked team, right, we got to the national championships. And this was held in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, right? And when you're the number one ranked team, everyone is looking at you and gunning to take you down. And I remember the first 5 games in sort of the pool round, we won all 5. And then we got to the semifinals and we won that game as well. So now we're in the finals of the national championships in a season that we were completely undefeated. What was interesting though was that the team that we were playing happened to also be the only other undefeated team in the country. Never before were there 2 undefeated teams meeting in the finals, the last game of the entire season. And this is a team we had never played against before, right? So that's just so rare. And they were from the East Coast. So like normally we do have, rare, but we do have a chance to play with teams from other regions. But this particular team, East Carolina, never seen them before. We heard about their reputation. But anyway, to cut the story short, it was a very intense game. Then ultimate games were quite long. So it was almost 3 hours. And ultimately we lost 2017. So completely heartbreaking, the taste of defeat when you have that much pressure on your shoulders. And I like to say that, well, it was because of that I resolved to do my master's so that I could have one more shot at another national championship. And so the following year, we actually also got to the national championship, but this time we lost in the semifinals. So never been a national champion before.
That's really unfortunate. After you finished your second national championship, I suppose you had to start thinking about what do I do with my life?
Indeed, right? Like you run out of eligibility, so you got to go out to the real world, scary as it is.
So you knew you didn't want to be an electrical engineer. How do you end up with consulting?
Well, again, because one of my senior teammates in the Ultimate Frisbee team, he went on to become a management consultant. So start talking to him amongst other people, and he was telling me about, wow, look, this is a really cool profession. We get to work on multiple projects, travel all around, work in different industries on a wide range of problems. And it was that breadth that excited me the most. I think what you'll find one theme over and over again in my whole life is I get bored easily. I find it difficult to just focus on one thing. And the prospect of a job that gave you that breadth of exposure was something that appealed to me a lot. And so I became very determined to want to be a management consultant. So another related theme, besides having a short attention span and being interested in too many things, is when I do decide I want to do something, I get very obsessed about it, like maniacally obsessed, right? Just like, okay, oh, I've just discovered ultimate frisbee. Like, I don't want to just learn how to throw a frisbee. I want to be like one of the best ultimate frisbee players in the country. And so when I discovered about management consulting, I'm like, okay, this is what I want to do. And I start applying to all the different firms and got rejected one after the other after the other. And I remember outside my college room, I had like this wall of shame, like 11 rejection letters. But, number 12, I got it. So, like I think each time you get rejected, you learn from that process. You're like, okay, I'm going to keep trying again, keep trying again.
Your 12th application was with Booz Allen Hamilton. You end up going to Singapore in 1995.
Right. Yes.
And I think you were posted straight to Thailand after that.
Yeah, pretty much once I settled in, within a few weeks, they're like, okay, we're going to have this project in Bangkok, and off you go. Boom. So
that must have been quite exciting then, because it
very,
was
like I was still in my early 20s. I think about it now, like, wow, I must have been a baby then, right? And being thrown in this deep end and having to pretend I know what I'm doing, and being in boardrooms with executives of an oil and gas company. It was just mind-blowing now to think about it.
And in 1996, you were in such a boardroom presenting to the senior management of an Indonesian client, and you bombed that presentation.
Oh, yes. Well, I don't know where you picked it up, but yes, that did happen. That was a really bad presentation. But actually, it wasn't so much the presentation was bad, right? I think I acted unprofessionally because I reacted quite negatively to the client who basically disagreed with whatever I was saying and what my team was saying. And this is where in life, it's not about who's right or who's wrong. Maybe I was naive thinking that, right, coming from an engineering background where you think there's always a right answer, there's always a formula and a solution to any problem. But in life, that's not the case. Solutions are not necessarily about who's right, but what matters is, do you gain people's trust? That was a very painful lesson because I got pulled aside by my boss who said, look, one more time that happens, we're going to kick you out. So rude awakening. But I deserved that kick in the butt.
Soon after that was the Asian financial crisis. And
indeed,
you must have seen the nature of your work change a lot because you're doing a lot of technical engineering things. And now it's all about finance.
Yes. Yeah. Because of the nature, right, where people were urgently needed in Thailand because of the whole economy, frankly, was under extreme duress. And so even though I had no financial sector experience, I got thrown into this project and I had to learn very quickly. I remember those were the days before Google, right? So you can't find information on the internet. I remember like buying textbooks on corporate finance and credit management and going over these thick textbooks in my hotel room so that I wouldn't look too dumb. Nowadays, any new topic, you can just do a quick Google search. Not then. The world existed before Google.
So you learned all about that. And then you eventually moved to McKinsey. And in 2001, you moved your entire family and your 3-year-old child to Korea.
That's right.
How did that happen?
Well, on one hand, we survived 97, 98 with the Asian financial crisis. Then things looked quite well. But then early 2000, there was this big dot-com crash. And I think Southeast Asia in particular, there was a bit of a setback. The economy was slowing down. And frankly, all the client work dried up. And so the only real work that was available was in Korea. And Korea is known to be a very tough place to do business, especially as a non-Caucasian foreigner then, but there's no choice, right? Like if that's the only place that's hiring and there's still work, then you got to do it. And of course, Korea is far enough. You can't just come back every weekend. So it meant having to relocate our young family in Seoul and just, again, being thrown in the deep end. And you got to now figure out, like learn enough Korean so that you can tell the taxi driver where you're going and learn how to connect and build trust with people who may not be trusting. So you got to earn trust in a very difficult situation.
So how did you actually earn that trust?
Well, I think this time, of course, I've learned to mostly listen first and talk less because of so many things that was happening. The one part that I was focusing on and leading was to help my Korean client put together a 3-way joint venture with an American firm and a European firm. Now, two-way joint ventures that are cross-border in different cultures is already very hard. Three-way is even much more complex. So not only were there the technical aspects like the valuation and the financial considerations or the legal structures or corporate structures, but very important for me was, well, how are decisions going to get made? How will this business operate when, leadership is devolved across people from different nationalities and different time zones, right? So we had to really think through how this was going to happen. And I think by, again, spending time being that intermediary, because my Korean clients were not as comfortable to be forthright and communicate directly with the two potential partners. So I was the go-between, and then to help listen to everybody and come up with ideas on how we can actually find the right compromise in each of probably over 100 points that you needed, resolutions on. So that starts with listen more and then position what you want to recommend in the context of what is important to the other people.
You must have enjoyed it enough to feel like you wanted to make it a more permanent move to Korea.
Yes. I mean, because, for the first time in my life, I felt I was really seen as a trusted advisor, right? Not just someone who knows how to do slick PowerPoint presentations. What I then learned that real consulting was not in these presentations or decks that a lot of the young consultants focus on. But real consulting was when after work, you go out and share a meal with your client, and that your client trusts you enough to really open up about what his or her deep-seated concerns and issues and problems are, and then just wants to get your help to help them achieve clarity or decide what to do. So not in the boardroom, not in formal meetings or presentations, but in just kind of quiet one-on-one conversations. And that was the time when I felt really being able to be valued by someone for my counsel, right? Not just for my PowerPoint presentations or numbers or Excel spreadsheets. And that's why I felt, look, I really can see this. I really enjoyed that professionally. And so I said, look, I'm going to want to change my status in Korea from a visiting consultant to a permanent employee of the McKinsey Korean office.
So what happened? Because you ended up returning to KL instead of staying in Korea.
So it was the first of what would become a number of seminal phone calls, because literally as I was in the meeting room or in the office of the managing partner of McKinsey Korea, having a conversation about wanting to permanently transfer to the Korean office, his phone rings. Again, those times, yes, we had a few mobile phones, but they were very crude phones. So most people used office landlines, right? So his phone rings, and it was the managing partner in McKinsey Southeast Asia, who said, hey, look, we've just won the mandate to advise the Kuala Lumpur Stock Exchange on this pretty complex restructuring exercise to turn it from a non-profit sort of government-linked organization to a for-profit company that would be a public listed company by itself. And it would be a very political and complex exercise. And we probably need some senior coverage to deal with a lot of the Malaysian political and regulatory leaders. And Azran's the most senior Malaysian we have in the firm. Can we have him back, please? Right? And I said, oh, okay, well, sure. All right, I'll go back and probably just help the team kick off and get started. But I really wanted to come back to Korea. But then sometimes in life, you start down one path and you think it's temporary, just like Korea. And if it was temporary, this time that work turned out to be really amazing also, to be again, being seen as a trusted advisor of the executive chairman of the stock exchange, where he then eventually said, hey, no one understands how a privatized for-profit stock exchange should work. I don't have the resources to keep hiring McKinsey to advise me. I want to, have you join me as an employee, right? And show me that you can turn your ideas into reality. So don't just advise, but do. And that was the first time when you put it to me that way, right? It's a bit like, don't just learn how to throw a frisbee, but be really good at it. So the idea of, after almost 10 years of just being an advisor, now someone's saying, look, advice doesn't get too much, right? You've got to be able to do it. And here was an opportunity from someone that I had a lot of respect for, who said, I think you should do this. And so I did. So I quit McKinsey and joined my client.
So this person was the former executive chairman, Mohammed Aslan Hashem. And he didn't just give you the challenge, he asked you to take a 50% pay cut. So it was
Of course. Yeah, because like we don't pay McKinsey salary, so this is all I can offer you, right? And you got to take it. So I'm like, oh, okay.
What were the highlights from that time for you?
Oh, so many things. I mean, clearly, at first, life was a lot more sensible because instead of flying around every week like a mad person, I think for that year and a half, I was only in Malaysia. I mean, I had to go to a few other places in Sabah, Sarawak, North and South Peninsula to meet stakeholders, but nothing like having to go to the airport and travel around the world. So just much appreciated stability in my travel schedule. The other thing for me that was like, wow, was the whole experience of dealing with the Malaysian parliament, because to give effect to the corporatization and privatization of the stock exchange, we needed to have 5 bills passed in parliament. 5, right? And I had to deal, and it was complex. It was like the Securities Industries Act, Malaysian Derivatives Exchange Act, and the Malaysian Securities Clearinghouse Act, etc. So these are complex pieces of legislation. And actually, I think the Minister of Finance and the Deputy Minister of Finance just had no interest in it, right? Because it was just not very exciting. And I was left with the newly appointed Deputy Finance Minister 2, right? Who just transferred from being the Deputy Tourism Minister. So her name was Dato' Ng Yen Yen. And she just got this role, and her seniors told her, look, it's yours. You've got to now shepherd these 5 bills. And credit to her, she took on that challenge. And I had the privilege of having to sit in a room with her like all day, explaining to her like, these are how all these bills worked. And I remember then also being in parliament that one day that she had to debate and convince the other parliamentarians to vote on it. And when she got questions, you know, from the members of the opposition or even her own party, like I had to like write answers on a piece of paper and pass it to her, you know, and in Bahasa, mind you, because it's in the parliament. So that again, like it's one of these things you do once in your life, right? And I know some people make a career out of it, but I was like, wow, definitely not your regular corporate experience.
So not long after Muhammad Aslan Hashim left, you also left to join Astro.
Yes.
So how did that happen?
Well, another phone call. And again, right, because he's like, well, you know, I think you should be, you know, like the CFO of this new listed company. I'm like, yeah, okay. But he then said, well, but I'm retiring. I'm going to go play golf. I'm like, oh, but I joined because of you, right? Like, if you're not going to be here, I don't know whether I want to stay. And again, in life, suddenly when you're in that period of like, do I really want to stay or not? A phone rings and someone said, I want you to meet the CEO of Astro. I'm like, okay. At that point, Astro had also just completed their IPO. They raised, I think, 2 billion ringgit, and they wanted to go from being a Malaysian television broadcaster to being a regional television broadcaster. So they wanted to make a lot of investments across the region and said whether I wanted to lead that effort. I was like, wow, okay, well, I don't know anything about broadcasting or entertainment, but I'm game for a challenge. You give me a challenge, I want to take it. So that's what I did.
I imagine for a lot of people, the idea of having to restart and learn an entire industry from scratch is daunting. So can you give us an idea of how you started that journey? Because you didn't know anything about tech.
But what I had a lot of experience by then was learning about new industries, right? Because again, right, I come from an engineering background, and first I had to learn oil and gas, then I had to learn steel manufacturing, then I had to learn banking, right? Then telcos. So this is something new. And again, right, by then there was probably Google, but there wasn't the richness of information available. A lot of it was textbooks. A lot of it was finding out who are the smart people around the world and how do I get connected with them and ask them a ton of questions. And so it was hard work to learn, but you know, I think I kind of enjoyed that, right? Like just the discovery phase.
So one of the things I picked up is that for Indonesia, in 10 months, you hired 450 people, you built 5 Indonesian cable channels, launched a national sales and distribution network, built a broadcast center, a lot of things that you achieved in just 10 months. But then you often say as well that one of your big failures was that you had to shut down the business and let go 450 people. And I wonder, you know, looking back, what happened and what kind of lessons you derived from that experience?
Well, again, number one lesson is real business is not what you write on a business plan. because so many people spend so much effort trying to have the perfect business plan, the perfect 10-year cash flow models, etc. But you can plan all you want. But in life, it's not about what's on paper, but it's the relationships that you form. And also when it comes to relationships, when things are rosy, it's always easier to come to an agreement, make decisions together. Where it gets tough is when real differences of opinions come into play, and that's when conflict comes in, right? And so in this case, the two principles, the Malaysian principle that I represent and the Indonesian principle didn't get along, right? They just had some fundamental disagreements, and that led to a mutual decision not to continue to fund this new venture. And without funding, you die, right? So that's the reality, that relationships can appear to be strong initially, but if it's not nurtured and not maintained, it will fracture, and these are the consequences.
You were 36 in 2007 when you became the CEO of AirAsia X. How did that happen?
Another phone call. Because once the decision was made to effectively pull out of that Indonesian business, right, I'm kind of, again, stuck. Okay, well, what do I do? Again, in life, phone call comes in and someone says, I'd like to introduce you to a gentleman by the name of Tony Fernandez. I was like, oh, who is he? Didn't even know, I was thinking, am I going to meet some kind of expat guy? Turns out he's another Malaysian from KL. And so that's life, right? Like random phone calls happen. And I think it's mainly because rather than kind of look for opportunities, but if you focus on doing what you do and you really are obsessed about it, I think your work will speak for itself. And then people will come and look you up.
And were you intrigued right from that conversation that this is something you wanted to enter into?
Well, mainly because, first of all, Tony's probably bar none, one of the most amazing salespeople, right? Like if he wants to sell you an idea or a concept, you're going to get convinced. But what really intrigued me was when he said, no one in the world has ever done a low-cost long-haul model. All the experts in the industry says it cannot be done. We should try, just for the sake of proving the world wrong. Right. And so I guess he knew which buttons to press with me, right? Like when you frame it as that challenge, like how can I not just drop everything and say, all right, game on, let's do this.